Hi, my name is Cornelius, and today I would like to talk to you guys about Frank Gehry. So, Frank Gehry was born February 28, 1929 in Toronto, Canada. He grew up in a Jewish family, and this will become significant later in his life. Gehry always felt that his grandparents were the ones who showed him that the world is full of possibilities, and that they were the ones who introduced him to the world of building. As a young kid, Gehry would often find himself building imaginary homes and cities using unconventional building materials, which will later become his specialty. As a high schooler, Gehry often found himself hanging out in lecture halls and in the library after classes, self-educating himself on science. But the turning point came when he heard a lecture by an architect named Asiero Alto, and seeing the buildings and the work, he realized that this was his interest at large. So Gehry decided to apply for architecture school at USC, where in one of his design classes, the professor called him up and told him that he should give up architecture as Gehry, according to him, wasn't suited for the profession. But Gehry contributed this event more towards anti-Semitism rather than criticism. After graduating, Gehry joined the military, but he had issues with his leg and was more in the infirmary than in maneuvers, and eventually started helping the doctor design a hospital for when the doctor returns to Alabama. The doctor eventually got Gehry out of maneuvers and into a project to do interior design for the military, and Gehry eventually moved up to architecture. This is where Gehry started designing a furniture line, which he would eventually sell to the public. Gehry then decided to go and apply for Harvard, but after 2 years dropped out because they wouldn't accept him for the major that he wanted. After dropping out, Gehry moved to Santa Monica, where he remodeled his house, which is the first project that got Gehry into the public eye and noticed by the architectural industry. Gehry then joined an architectural firm and started working on residential homes, but ultimately moving up to bigger projects, all incorporating his deconstructivist style. Gehry prided himself on being a technological innovator as well as a maker of unusual form, even though he never used a computer. He has a unique way of designing, as he actually builds models and then uses software from the aerospace industry that's adapted to architecture to get the model in this digital form so that the plans can be created. Ultimately, what we realize from Gehry is that he makes architecture that both inspires thought and brings pleasure, which is his way of making an impact in this world. So, Gehry subscribes to the deconstructivist style. This is a development of postmodern architecture characterized by fragmentation and manipulation of structures' surfaces using non-rectilinear shapes. The result then is a distortion or dissociation of architectural elements to create unpredictability and controllable chaos. The philosophy behind deconstructivism is the idea that our architectural world starts with order, predictability, geometric shapes placed for function, and thus orderly constructed. The deconstructivist, then, is to take this constructed world and deconstruct it, an attempt to move away from the normal constructing rules of modernism and complete rejection of ornament geometry. Almost similar to Wassily Kandinsky moving to abstract art from figurative work. So, what are the elements of deconstructivism? Well, it has a tendency toward deformation and an aspect of expressionism. It's ultimately architecture being altered by the massing, spatial envelopes, and planes. So, if you look at the pictures, you can see the buildings. They are unconventional. It looks odd yet intrigue the mind at the same time. It makes you stop and wonder at its unusual shape, yet it fits right into the environment. That is deconstructivism at its best. Gehry's work ultimately is a textbook example of this style. So let's look at the buildings and see how they match up. So first up is the Dancing House, built in 1996 in Prague. An interesting story behind the building is that during World War II, the now president used to live next to the site, which was leveled after a bombing. The president always felt a special connection to the site and wanted it to have great significance. He eventually commissioned Gehry to design a magnificent building on the site, and this is exactly what he did. The building initially looks odd, crooked, almost like something out of a Dr. Seuss book. The building was designed to represent a man and woman dancing, the curved building showing elements of femininity, and the rigid, straight building representing the masculine. In reality, Gehry was inspired by Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, who were really good dancers at the time, and he thought that the building would commemorate them and be a showpiece to Prague. The building itself is a masterpiece as it took 99 concrete panels, each one different in shape and dimension, and they all had to be built in a way to accommodate each other, which is an engineering feat in itself. Once complete, the building was commissioned as a commercial building, and today there are restaurants, shops, and offices. The building ultimately represents not only unique design in the eyes of the outside world, but to Prague, this building is a statement of liberation, freedom, and democratic belief. And the reason is because it is so different from the rest of the constructed world. It's a diamond in the rough, if you will. Next, we move to one of my favorite buildings, and that is the Walt Disney Concert Hall. This is probably one of Gehry's most famous buildings and a perfect example of deconstructivism. The building was built in 2003 in downtown LA, and really, it's two buildings in one. And here's why. From the outside, it looks like a bunch of metal plates orchestrated in odd shapes, yet seems to all come together to create an idea of reflection, of grandeur, of art. It's meant to be a comparison of undulating and angled forms that represent musical movement and the motion of LA. The really interesting part, though, is that the interior is completely different from the exterior, hence the 2-in-1. The interior was meant to be a single volume, where the orchestra and audience occupy the same space. And because Gehry worked with Manuel Rosales, an organ designer, and Yoshia Toyota, an acoustic consultant, the building has world-class acoustics. Another interesting aspect of the building is that if you look around, there is no box seating or divisions in chairs, and that's because Gehry was trying to make a statement. His whole life, Gehry was trying to fight segregation and anti-Semitism. And by removing separate seating, it's Gehry's way of fighting this segregation. Very clever, if you ask me. And it makes the experience so much better. And lastly, I like to talk about the IAC building. The IAC building was built in 2007 in Chelsea, New York. Now, the story behind this building was that Dillard, the CEO, imagined sailing his boat into the harbor and looking up at an amazing glass building as he sailed past it in his yacht. But Dillard had his reservations about Gehry, as he thought Gehry's style would be both arbitrary and expensive, and that it would be too hard to control either Gehry's design instincts or his budget. Gehry managed to convince Dillard on his design and pulled it off, getting a 10-story tower of white glass built in New York, and at a reasonable price. The reason Dillard was so ecstatic about the building, from the side, it looks like a sailboat, which to Dillard is what he was all about. If you look at the interior, on either side, it looks more like an art gallery than an office building, with all its curves everywhere. This only makes the building a work of art, but it also makes it a fancy office where anyone would like to work. So all in all, Gehry deserves the Pulitzer Prize for his lasting impact, not just on the deconstructivist style and architectural industry, but on the overall society around the world. His buildings have left lasting impressions and has made thousands of people see odd shapes and yet feel like it's right at home. So here's to Gehry, and may his work influence thousands more.